Hi, my name is Rebecca Clark, and I will be doing the Intro to Lincoln Douglas debate lecture via Outreach Debate. Okay, so let's start with the fundamental question. What is Lincoln Douglas, or often shortened to LD debate? So, Lincoln Douglas debate is fundamentally inspired by the historical debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Hence, there's a focus on philosophy and ethics. This is why LD debate is often known as a values debate. LD resolutions, therefore, don't ask what we should do. Rather, they ask what we ought to do. Most people tend to think that this difference is meaningless, but it actually adds a lot of value to the format. If we're transitioning out of another debate format, which I often see happen with, for instance, PF debaters, and into LD debate, this is one of the most important takeaways of the introduction to LD, and that's probably the most important takeaway of this video itself. Okay, so let's just briefly go over the LD debate format. This is not something that you should necessarily have memorized right now, but it's helpful to at least be aware with these numbers, and as you get more familiar with doing LD debate, they should feel natural. So in LD, we say that there is an affirmative and a negative. If you are the affirmative, you affirm the resolution, and if you're a negative, you negate or you deny it. So you start off with an affirmative speech every single time, 6 minutes. Then there's a cross-examination of the affirmative where only the negative is asking questions. That goes for 3 minutes. Then the negative response for 7 minutes in both a constructive speech and a rebuttal speech. And we'll talk about these speeches individually later. Then there's a cross-examination also for 3 minutes, an AF rebuttal for 4, neg rebuttal for 6, and an AF rebuttal for 3. These numbers seem to be a little strange or random at times, but as you do the format, it slowly makes sense precisely why they're as long as they are. And it guarantees that both teams have the same amount of speaking time, just a different distribution of that time. Okay, so fundamentally, what distinguishes LD from other debate events? So first, the slightly less intuitive speech format, but that isn't really significant. These other two matter a lot more. For starters, one thing that scares a lot of people away from doing LD, or it really draws them to it, is the fact that you're debating alone. For me, I enjoy the individuality, and I don't come from a very good school team, so I couldn't see myself partnering with anybody that attends my school and would be a good teammate in another format for me. So I just don't see that level of compatibility, and that attracts me to LD because I like the individuality. But for a lot of people, they find it to be lonely. And plus, when you're working as an individual, that's another person that can't be sharing the prep burden and the workload. So as an individual, yes, you get some level of independence, I guess, and you don't have to rely on a teammate who could potentially drag you down. But on the other hand, now you don't have somebody to support you along the way, and you don't have somebody to share the work with you. So this can definitely be like a deal breaker for a lot of people when considering doing LD debate. For me, I always have my novices start in another event, typically PF or World Schools. That way they have the compatibility of working with a teammate and they have somebody to support them, but they're still debating and they're still getting a feel for things. Additionally, what distinguishes LD, as we said we talk about in this video, is the values debate. LD is inherently focused on philosophy and ethics, and in some rounds, like these ethical debates won't necessarily be complex, but in some rounds they will. And it's the potential for rounds to be philosophically complex that means that you have to be thinking about ethics and you have to be thinking about philosophy, even if these aren't 100% of your debates. Okay, so on to that topic. Why do we call LD a values debate, and what does that necessarily mean? So in many events, you'd traditionally consider the round to be something called utilitarianism, utilitarian, meaning that your focus is doing the most good for the most people. So like, for instance, teams arguing over US military presence would likely discuss how many lives on their side are likely to be saved or ended via some sort of policy action. But in LD, a round could come down to aligning with an ethical framework centered around maybe justice, which in some instances, justice wouldn't say just do the most good for the most people. Justice would say that you have to align with certain codes of ethic, like the protection of rights. Now, a lot of times we agree that justice is good, but the point being made is that sometimes we assume that we should weigh things, and specifically weigh things in debate, on the basis of, well, how many lives do we save? Well, how many taxpayer dollars do we save? But sometimes in LD debate rounds, depending on the philosophy the round is centered around, Well, this means that you might not necessarily just be maximizing utility. You might rather be focusing on certain aspects or certain requirements that you have to meet before you can care about utility, because you're more concerned about ethics in the round. Okay, so what does having a values debate look like? Well, first, what's the purpose of the value debate and why do we engage in these discussions? And understanding this is crucial in order to being able to engage and have these kind of debates. Well, in simple words, the purpose of a values debate and the purpose of LD debate is to not assume that we have a common purpose, such as protecting lives, but it's to engage in ethical discussions for what societies should prioritize. I mean, the purpose is that we don't assume justice is correct. We don't assume focusing on utility is correct, but rather we assume that a debate's to be had over what society should prioritize. And once we have that debate, then we can link in our impacts and then we can see, well, who achieves this thing that we just agreed was important. So the question is what the round should be aimed towards protecting or creating, and it creates a lens through which the judge can acquit and judge the rest of the round. So, like for an example, the trolley problem. The trolley problem has been asked for many, many years, and traditionally people follow the same kind of lens when they look at it. It's the hypothetical setup where you're like at a lever and there's this train, and the train is barreling down a specific path, and if it follows that path, it's gonna hit and kill 6 people. Or you can pull the lever and the train will only hit one person. Well, it creates kind of two ethical questions. One, do we care about protecting more lives? Because obviously, if you pull the lever, you save 5 people, as opposed to like a full six dying, only one die. But the other question is, do you have the right to pull that lever and to decide the livelihood of the one person? Because although you'd be saving 5 people, you're taking it upon yourself to decide to kill that other person. So do you have the ethical right to do so? Well, most people just kind of presume that the top priority should be saving lives, and so a majority of people, when handling this dilemma, will say pull the lever. And that's because that's what a utilitarian would generally think. The utilitarian would say, well, let's maximize utility. And so therefore they'd want to protect lives, they'd pull the lever, less people would die, and that would be the end of the discussion. However, some systems of morality and ethics, for instance, Kant would say that killing's wrong. I mean, it deprives people of livelihood, autonomy, morality, etc. So killing is wrong in all instances, and that can never be violated. So these kind of philosophers would say that, well, you can't pull the lever because that would kill them, and then you would be, well, violating their livelihood. And so they would say pulling the lever is morally wrong. Now, some people would respond, well, you should pull the lever to save more lives, right? And the philosopher would probably respond that if we followed their code of ethics, that those people would never be tied down in the first place. So it creates a really interesting discussion about like what kind of systems of ethics, philosophy, or even judgment we should follow in aligning with the world. Should we be utilitarian? I don't know, I keep making that mistake and only be concerned about lives and like actual outcomes, or should we be concerned about like the ethical implications of our actions and certain codes of conduct that we as a society have to follow? Now, truthfully, in life, it's kind of a balance. I mean, like we follow laws, but sometimes there are loopholes, and like societies agree that there are some rules we should follow, but some rules that we can bend a little. So, truthfully, there's no concrete answer, and that's what makes doing this so hard for debaters. There's not a final solution to like, should you be a utilitarian, or should you like follow Rawls, or should you follow this author, or should you follow this other? There's no singular answer. And instead, you have to be able to understand how these systems of philosophy interact. And then, depending on that, you also have to be able to debate about it and discuss it in a way that not only makes sense to your judge, but I mean, is also effective considering that you have time restraints in given speeches. So, not only do you have to understand that different systems of thought exist that could fundamentally shape how we address problems or the policy actions we would take, but then you also have to be able to explain those systems, explain the differences, refute systems, and then you have to also be able to apply them to the resolution at hand. So the values debate is what catches a lot of people up in LD because they think like, oh, let me just stand up and talk about morality or something. But then they're not fully sure how to engage in round. And so the main purpose of this presentation is just to talk about what is a value, what are the kinds of values, how do you interact with these, and then let's put them in context of actual debate rounds. Okay, so for this philosophical kind of debate in LD, you don't just stand up and say like I support Kant and then just talk about Kant for a while. Rather, you typically have, at least in traditional rounds on a local level, you will have two parts to the philosophical debate. You have a value and a value criterion, creating what we could call overall a value premise. So first, what is a value? So the value in an LD debate round, typically at the very top of your speech, it might be one of the first few things you talk about and one of the first few things you provide evidence for. The purpose of a value is to tell what is valuable. And it identifies the thing that society is trying to protect. So when you provide a value, you are telling your judge, this is the thing in the round that we should say is valuable. This is the thing in the round that's important, or really, this is the thing in the world that's important. And this should be the end goal of the round. So that might just be morality. I mean, your value might literally be morality, and you might connect it back to the resolution, or just connect that morality is necessary to like the preservation of human well-being or dignity or various other things. So for the sake of that round, the thing that is valuable is morality, and that should hypothetically be the end goal of the round. So an example could be, I value justice, defined as giving each their due. This is a line I've heard debaters repeat 100 times at the beginning of speeches. Like, hi, my name's blank. I'm affirming the resolution. I value justice, defined as giving each their due. Simple, straightforward. This would suggest that the goal of the round is not just to protect lives, but more importantly, to address structural inequalities and ensure that everyone receives what they are quote unquote due, hence the phrase giving each their due. I mean, it's about having access to the rights that you should or are guaranteed, and it's about equality in terms of like processing and distribution and things like that. So a value holds a lot of meaning, and it tells you what the round's centered around, and it tells you what the goal of the round should be. And so therefore, it kind of frames your discussions in the round, because you're less likely to discuss things that are irrelevant to the value, because based on your argumentation, they wouldn't be nearly as valuable. Okay. But the thing is, sometimes these systems can be a little vague. Like, I can say my value is justice, and you can say your value is morality, and then we can sit there and be like, well, some things achieve both. But really, like, what is justice and how do we achieve it? I mean, I could argue that we achieve justice, like, via the protection of rights. But there are like different kinds of justice. There are different authors. There are different ways to achieve it. I mean, you could easily argue that justice kind of necessitates being alive in the first place, because if you aren't alive, I mean, I guess like if people are unfairly killed, that's pretty unjust. So I mean, it's easy to connect that like livelihood and societal welfare impacts to justice. It's easy to connect that rights and equity impact to justice, and that we should care maybe more or less about things like structural violence. So the question is really, if so, you give a value of justice, how exactly do you achieve it? Because that's vague. And without that being defined in the round, I mean, realistically, both teams could easily link in. So that's where the value criterion comes into play. The purpose of the value criterion is to say, okay, we've identified this thing that's valuable, so let's set some criteria for how we are meant to achieve that value. That way we're in agreement. Like, we have justice as this value. Now let's agree to some way we achieve it, and then we can measurably define what either team has to do to therefore achieve the value and therefore prove that they've achieved the valuable thing and therefore win the round. So again, the value criterion measures or quantifies how to achieve that thing that's your value. So example, if I were setting justice as a value for a value criterion, I could talk about the social contract. I could talk about due process, the protection of rights, etc. And there are hundreds of different ways I could argue technically that we can achieve justice. So the value criterion just clarifies a measure or a link by which we achieve that value. So yeah, it could be argued that there are several ways to measure justice, so a criterion could be necessary to defending that maybe you achieve justice better than your opponents. Because you could be in a round where both sides agree that the value should be morality, or the value should be justice, or the value should be health, or some form of well-being. And maybe both teams, in some way, shape, or form, do achieve this value. So you just need to be ready to argue why one way of achieving the value is more effective than another. AKA, you need to be arguing which value criterion is the best. In my opinion, debating the value criterion tends to be more important than debating the value, because oftentimes certain things will link into several values. Like, there are broad things in society, like the protection of rights is probably good for justice and for morality. So oftentimes it's pretty easy to link certain actions on behalf of an affirmative into like any value, but it's the value criterion that delineates exactly how you're meant to link in. So, in my opinion, debating over the value criterion is oftentimes more valuable than debating over the value itself. Because, like, we probably all agree morality is good, but the question is which team achieves morality best, which the value criterion defines, and therefore is probably more important to the judgment in the round. Okay. Now, one thing I tell my beginners a lot is to stop viewing values and value criterions as these like ostracized kind of strange things. Like they seem very out there and like totally hypothetical. Like sometimes the question's like, how practical is even the application of talking about values or criterions? I mean, like oftentimes we think about these things, like we think about justice and morality, but we don't sit here and like really distinguish them in our minds and really think about how to achieve them. Like we think about these terms in a much broader sense. And so a lot of times these discussions are, I mean, really, really hypothetical. They feel strange, maybe too nuanced, or maybe just too like out there and random. So for a lot of debaters, they don't look at them as real arguments. They look at them as these like weird aspects of the round that they just want to get through. So I tell my beginners, like, treat them like any other argument. A value and a value criterion are inherently an argument. They aren't just this like weird thing that appears at the top of your speech, but they are an argument about what's important in life. And then they're an argument about how to achieve that important thing. And functionally, I mean, it's not much different from an argument about like a policy action being good or bad. I mean, we can interact with these arguments the same we can interact with any other. And once you start thinking about values and value criterions in those senses, then it's easier to actually engage with them and debate with them when you stop thinking of them as this like weird, other kind of separate, distinguished thing. So yeah, you can debate between value criterions, and often you can refute them in similar ways to refuting contentions. So, for instance, I mean, you could argue about impacts. Like, perhaps you could argue that an equitable framework should be prioritized because you read an impact card showing that structural violence is really, really important, or that it's hurting a lot of people to a high degree. So, there are different ways to refute values and value criterions. You can talk about impacts, links, topicality, anything. A lot of these arguments also apply to any other argument in a debate round, and we'll talk soon about what these individually look like. Okay. I'll also note, many beginner judges, at the very least in the leagues I'm in, are often told to look out for values and criterions the most. Because LD fundamentally is like kind of any other debate format to some level. I mean, once you get into like technical debating and once you start debating progressively or you go onto like the national circuit, I mean, yeah, things kind of get unique. And then you need to know more about the differences between LD and different debate formats. But on a traditional local level, Lincoln Douglas debate is just any debate round, but with the addition of philosophy, essentially. And just with different speech times and you're alone, like we said earlier. So for these rounds, I find that a lot of my judges are told, like, oh, just treat it like another debate round, but look out for this. And so these judges are told, like, what makes LD unique is the value criterion. So if they don't have a value, or if they don't have a criterion, or if they don't talk about it, why would they win? So I have found in my experience that even if I don't do an amazing job debating these things, like even if at the end of the round I'm like, man, I really mishandled that, just talking about it and bringing it up like gets the attention of your judges because it's on their rubrics. It's what they're told by tournament directors. It's what they're told again when they look up information about LD debate. It's what these judges identify as being the most unique, and therefore they expect you to talk about it. So don't just shy away from the value and value criterion debate because you're like, oh, they don't care about it. Because 9 times out of 10, they do. And that doesn't mean that you have to spend like 5 minutes on it, but that means like bring it up. At least mention it, reaffirm that you have a value and a criterion. And if you think it impacts the round at all, be ready to debate why yours is better than your opponent's, or be ready to debate why you should win under either value and criterion. That way your judge sees that you're engaging with this thing that makes the debate format unique. And oftentimes, if your judge isn't so qualified as to understand the arguments that you're making in the round, at the very least, they're able to notice that you talked about the thing that they expected you to talk about. And they like that, and they give you points for it. And I find that I get RFDs like, great job talking about the value and criterion, even when I don't think I like said good things about it. They just like that you talk about it. Okay, so now that we've discussed what the value and value criterion are, let's briefly go through the different LD speeches. That way you know like where the value criterion should appear, as well as the different things you're doing in the speech. You'll find that LD debate again, at this traditional level, is kind of like any other debate format, realistically, just with the volume criterion. So that changes how you interact with the round, but otherwise, you're still debating like you would in most other formats. Okay, so as we said earlier, the AF starts with a 6-minute 1AC. This is a fundamentally constructive speech. The AF always speaks first, and so there's nothing you can respond to. I mean, maybe you can predict something that the negative is going to talk about, and so maybe you have some like front lines in your 1AC, or maybe you have some preemptive arguments, like if the negative responds, or like people often respond, some critique that, and then some exchange of words. So, maybe you do a little predicting. But otherwise, you don't have anything to respond to. This is the first speech of the round. So this first affirmative speech should be entirely prepared. It's entirely constructive. That means that you are establishing the value premise. So you'll probably say like, hi, my name is blank. I'm affirming the resolution. My value for this debate round is blank. And then you should briefly define it. If you really want to, you could go into more detail or less detail, really depending on what the value is. And then you'll obviously read your value criterion. You'll explain like how you apply to that value. For me, I follow a general format. I'll say the value criterion is blank. I'll explain how the value criterion connects to the value. And then I'll explain what actions the value criterion can be achieved by, or why the value criterion or why the value criterion is important for the round. And then you can also, if necessary, provide a definition. And then you're going to read your contentions. And if you're not aware, contentions are your main arguments made in the round. So maybe you have 3 arguments, maybe you have 2, maybe you have 1. It totally depends on what's strategic for you at the time. Now, especially as you're getting into debate formats, especially if you haven't done one before, and if you're just new to debate entirely, and you're starting with LD, and that's why you're watching this, I find that a lot of like people starting in these debate formats will often ask like, well, how long do I spend on contentions? And how long do I spend on the definition? And how long do I spend on the value? And how long do I spend on this? And I know this answer is really, really horrible and frustrating to hear every time. But honestly, I think the best answer is that you should do it strategic. I will go to tournaments and I'll have on the negative 4 contentions. And then I'll go to another and I'll have 1. And it just depends on what I feel is strategic, considering the topic and maybe considering my audience. Now, if you're totally new and you don't have much support and you're like, well, I don't even know it's strategic, I would say if you have a definition, it shouldn't be like 3 minutes long. Keep it 30 seconds. I would say your value premise entirely, maybe 30 seconds. I mean, unless it's really complex, and I would stray away from doing something really complex at a local circuit because your judges might not be familiar with your philosophy. So your value premise should be short. Your definition should be short. And then your contention should be the bulk of your speech. Later on, you might spend more time connecting back your value premise, but for the sake of the speech, you just need to define it, explain what it is, and identify that you have one. Okay, then you have a negative response speech. You'll hear this either called the 1NC or the 1NR. 1NC is much more common. So this speech is fundamentally both constructive and rebuttal speech. So like the AF, you're going to establish your value premise, you're going to provide a definition if necessary, you're going to read contentions. But the AF has 6 minutes to do just these things, and as the negative for this first speech, you have 7 minutes to do these things and do refutations. So that means, because fundamentally the AF just spoke, and your judge is sitting there, and they just hear an affirmative that makes a lot of really great points, hopefully, and your judge is sitting there thinking, okay, well now this negative gives me good responses, but what about that affirmative contention? So in this negative speech, you do need to be responding to the affirmative. Because if you don't respond, you're essentially conceding the arguments that were just made. And you can bring a lot of great arguments yourself, but if you have 3 great arguments and they have 3 great arguments, well, like, what are we just doing if we're just sitting here restating our own arguments? I mean, it's kind of hard for the judge to then decide who wins the round without intervening on the flow or intervening and deciding for themselves what matters more than other arguments. So for the sake of this negative, you not only want to be responding to the affirmative, but you also want to be doing your own constructive, and that means that really this negative speech is going to vary a lot in terms of your timing, which is why it's even harder for me to say how long it should be. Because, you should spend maybe still 30 seconds on value, maybe still 30 seconds on definition, but you need to cut time on contentions or cut times wherever you can because you also want to do a good rebuttal. For me, I find that I probably spend like give or take half of my time doing each. I think often I'll do like 4 minutes on rebuttal, 4 minutes on constructive and like 3 minutes on rebuttal. Because usually at the traditional level, you have stuff to respond to, but you don't have a lot to respond to. And oftentimes on the local level, like arguments are kept pretty generic, and your contentions will often already have stuff that kind of respond to the other side. So it's easy if you read those contentions and then during rebuttal you reference your contention. Like, let me point out that contention 2 includes evidence that says this, which responds to their evidence, and my evidence is more recent. So like yada yada yada. So I find that spending slightly more time on the constructive aspect of the speech is probably more strategic. Okay, so then you have the second affirmative or speech called the 1AR, which stands for first affirmative rebuttal. And this is the 4-minute speech. So again, this is a rebuttal speech. At this point, it's not constructive. You're not like reading new contentions or new definition. I mean, you might be reading new evidence in rebuttal, but this is inherently just a rebuttal speech. So you're going to extend your constructive arguments. So if you had a contention in the affirmative, so for some debaters, they don't fully understand why they need to do this thing called extending. We use these two words a lot. We talk about extending and we talk about dropping arguments. And debaters will hear like extend, extend, extend. And sometimes they ask like, well, why do I need to extend? Like the judge heard my argument. Why do I need to bring it up again if I'm just telling them the same thing? Well, think about it this way. A lot of things get said in round. And let's say that the affirmative and the 1AC, they read this like really impactful argument. And then the 1AR, they don't talk about it. At that point, if I were the negative and I have a lot to respond to, I'm kind of going to tell myself like, oh, well, the affirmative talked about a lot of other valuable things. So I figured that they just don't care about that other argument anymore. They're not talking about it anymore. So that means I don't need to talk about it anymore. Like we've moved away from this argument as the round progressed. Well, then it's kind of unfair if the affirmative gets up in their final speech, the 2AR, which keep in mind is the last speech of the round, and then they entirely talk about that one thing. Because it was not fair for the negative to have to predict that the affirmative would take this one argument that they didn't even re-reference in the 1AR and then spend their entire 3-minute 2AR on just that entirely. So you do have to be extending arguments throughout rounds. If you say something in your first speech, and if you want it to be in your last speech, and if you want the judge to think about it, then you need to bring these arguments up throughout the round. Because otherwise it demonstrates that, well, we're shifting the trajectory of the round and we no longer are talking about this. And to not extend that argument and to not bring it up again is relatively unfair. So that's why in this speech, you have to be extending your constructive arguments. If it's an argument you want the judge to evaluate, you bring it back up again. You're also going to be doing a lot of refutations. I mean, this is the main function of the 1AR anyways. You're going to be refuting. This is what the negative said, responding to their contentions. You're also going to be defending your own contentions. For the rebuttals they gave your contentions, you need to offer somewhat of a counter rebuttal or a defense, arguing why you're still right or you're still winning this argument, importantly. I always tell my beginners, and people just generally agree, that this is going to be the hardest speech all around because you had a 6-minute 1AC or first affirmative speech that you're trying to extend the arguments from and you're trying to defend the arguments from, and you're responding to that 7-minute first negative speech that's both constructive and rebuttal, and you have to respond and extend all of these things and defend all these things in 4 minutes. So it's so easy for the 1AR to miss something, to not have time to talk about it, to get caught up in other arguments and totally forget about it, etc. And at this point in the speech, sometimes it's a little hard to identify exactly what the direction of the round is going to be because the negative has only spoken once. And this affirmative speech kind of distinguishes and decides what the rest of the round is going to look like. So you're making a lot of choices in this 1AR speech about what to prioritize, what the focus of your speech should be, and what theme the rest of the round should be framed around. And oftentimes this 1AR is where people win or lose rounds. I will give a bad 1AR and I'll feel like it's useless to give the 2AR because I just know the round's over. I can't win anymore. And sometimes I give a great 1AR and then I know that, my 2AR doesn't matter too much. Although don't let that stop you from then giving a good 2AR. And we'll talk about that later. Okay, so then the negative has their second and final speech of the round. This is often just called the 2NR. For this negative speech, you're going to still be doing rebuttal, but this is your last time speaking to the judge. But luckily, you have a lot of time. I mean, this is a 6-minute speech. So this is a rebuttal speech, and keep in mind that the AF just gave a short 1AR, responsive to your 1NC that was 7 minutes. If your 1NC was good, and if the 1AR was not perfect, the 1AR probably missed something. Like they probably didn't respond well to some argument. They probably didn't respond well or defend well their argument. They probably didn't address something efficiently given their time. So the purpose of this 2&R is really to identify that thing and to just hammer them down with it, because this is the last time the judge hears you. Because the judge hears the AF first and last. So you just need this 2&R to identify the weaknesses of the AF so well that even after the AF gets another speech, that the judge is saying, yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but like the 2&R made this really good argument that reminded me that you failed to do XYZ, or that you actually caused this bad thing. So the 2&R is a rebuttal speech. You extend your constructive arguments, you do your refutations, and you really need to be thinking about this speech in terms of what did the AF fail to do correctly, and what am I equipped best to talk about? Because you have a 6-minute speech, so you have so much time to go through so much nuance, and you just use the speech well. Oh, and also just with the nature of this being like a final speech, this is not necessarily like required. But especially if you're at like a local circuit and your judges may be a parent or they're not as familiar with the topic or with debate itself, you might want to spend time summarizing the round or talking about things in more layman's terms. So you could spend some time crystallizing the round, identifying key points. You'll hear the term voter issue. So at the end of the round, you might even identify for your judges like key arguments that they should be thinking about the very most at the end of the round. So you should maybe spend some time in your 2&R, literally just clarifying the round, giving some summary, giving some whatever you think is helpful for the judge to be on the same wavelength as you. Okay, and then you have the final speech, the 2AR. This speech will usually not decide whether the AF wins. Usually the AF is kind of winning after the 1AR, or they're kind of losing after the 1AR. But don't let that just make you have a bad 2AR. Because I feel like sometimes I have a really good 1AR, and then I'm like, oh, I'm so locked. Like, it's a win, right? Like, I can't lose this round, right? And so I'm so confident, and then I'm overly confident almost, and then I don't treat the 2AR as seriously as I need to. So, that doesn't mean don't care about the 2AR. Like, still care about it. Because especially when you're in a local round, you have a parent judge that isn't as familiar with the technical aspect of doing debate, they still want to hear a good closing. They want to hear a pretty analysis, a pretty conclusion. And if the negative just gave a really, really persuasive 2&R, then yeah, your 2AR needs to be good. So the 2AR, you're doing the same things the 2&R is doing. This is a rebuttal speech. You extend your constructive arguments, you do refutations. Now, because this speech is so short, you don't really have time to be doing new refutations, and you can't be doing a fully new argument in the last speech anyways, because, there isn't a 3&R to respond. So this 2AR should just be almost entirely, well, not even almost, it should just be entirely based upon the speeches in the previous rounds. So you should be reiterating rebuttals you've already made. You should be talking about evidence that was read. You should be summarizing if you feel it's helpful and necessary. And you should just be doing all of those things that give your judge a good view of the overall round and should hopefully lock in the win if your 1AR was good. Okay, that's it for now. In future videos, we'll talk more about the values and criterions. We'll talk more about like how this looks practically. I'm considering right now maybe doing practice rounds in a way that like you could actually view these happening in real time and then get like opinions from, I guess, what would be like somebody acting as a judge. And that way you can see it practically. But until then, consider joining Outreach Debate. If you join the Discord server, you can see tons of information about open positions and state branches, volunteer opportunities, and just the fact that it creates a public space to hold discussion. You can also look up the Outreach Debate website. I think it's just Outreach Debate or just outreach.com. If you look it up on Google, you'll get a quick response. Thank you.